Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Science Channel. Tonight, we are wandering into a world that most people never give a second thought. A place where water rests among the trees, where the ground can shift beneath your feet, and where the air hums with wings, calls, and the slow-moving life that has learned to live there. Swamps have long been misunderstood. They have been called dark places, wild places, even empty places. Yet beneath their still surfaces lies one of the busiest living systems on Earth. Forests grow with their roots in water. Creatures hunt, hide, sing, and build their lives among flooded trunks and drifting leaves. Ancient mud quietly records the passage of centuries. And every season brings new rhythms of flood, drought, and renewal. The more closely we look, the more these wetlands reveal themselves as places of remarkable resilience, strange beauty, and deep ecological importance. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, there is nothing you need to do but relax. Let your shoulders soften and allow your eyes to grow heavy, and allow the day to gently fade away as we wander through this remarkable landscape together. Let's begin. Swamps can look quiet while building whole worlds beneath the water. From above, a swamp can seem almost motionless. The surface barely stirs. A fallen branch drifts nowhere. The trees stand as if they have been holding the same pose for centuries. Yet underneath that calm skin, countless lives are moving through a hidden city. Small fish thread between roots. Snails graze across submerged wood. Insect larvae hunt, breathe, and transform in water that seems empty to a casual glance. Crayfish burrow into mud. Worms turn decaying leaves into food for other creatures. Even the roots themselves create shelter, shade, and escape routes. What looks still to us is often busy beyond belief. That is part of the magic of swamps. They challenge the human eye. They ask you to look longer, listen harder, and notice that one of the busiest places in nature can first appear almost completely asleep. Some swamps store more carbon than forests, which are far taller and drier. That fact surprises many people because swamps do not always look grand in the way mountains or giant forests do. Yet their soaked soils can hold astonishing reserves of ancient carbon. In dry places, fallen leaves and dead wood usually break down more quickly and release much of their stored carbon back into the air. In waterlogged ground, that process slows. Layer after layer of plant material builds up, sometimes over thousands of years, and much of its carbon stays locked below the surface. A swamp may look soft, dark, and untidy, but beneath your feet, it can function like a vast archive of the atmosphere's past. This makes wetlands deeply important in the story of climate. When they remain wet, they stall. When they are drained or burned, they can release enormous amounts. A place that once seemed ordinary suddenly becomes one of the planet's great vaults. A swamp is one of Earth's busiest nurseries. For countless animals, these wetlands are not marginal places at all. They are beginnings. Shallow water, dense plant cover, and rich supplies of food create ideal conditions for young life. Tiny fish can shelter among roots and stems where larger predators struggle to follow. Tadpoles develop in pools protected from stronger currents. Hatchling turtles, insects, and young crustaceans all find space to feed and grow in this crowded but sheltered world. Many birds depend on swamps during breeding season because these places provide both nesting sites and a buffet for hungry chicks. Even species that spend much of their adult lives elsewhere often rely on wetlands when they are small and vulnerable. That gives swamps an importance far beyond their borders. They do not just support the creatures you see standing in them. They send life outward. They help stock rivers, lakes, coastlines, and forests with the next generation. In swamps, trees can grow with their roots standing in water. To most plants, waterlogged soil is a problem. Roots need oxygen, and flooded ground can cut that supply off. Yet swamp trees have evolved extraordinary ways to survive where other trees would suffocate. Some spread their roots through shallower layers where a little oxygen still reaches. Some develop structures that help move air from the trunk down into submerged tissues. Others anchor themselves in broad, flaring bases that give support in unstable mud. These are not weak trees clinging to a bad situation. They are specialists built for a world that drowns their competitors. That is why a swamp forest can feel so uncanny. It looks like woodland, yet it behaves by different rules. The trunks rise from water. The roots disappear into black mud. And what should seem impossible begins to feel normal. A swamp teaches you that life does not merely endure difficult conditions. It can master them with elegance. Some swamps can survive fire, flood, drought, and still return stronger. At first, that sounds impossible. Fire and drought seem like opposites of a wetland's nature. Flood sounds like more of the same. Yet many swamps are shaped by disturbance, not destroyed by it. In some places, seasonal drying exposes peat, seeds, and old plant material to changing conditions that open space for renewal. Certain fires burn through accumulated vegetation and clear crowded ground, allowing sunlight to reach seedlings that otherwise would never get their chance. Floods can bring fresh nutrients, spread seeds, and reconnect habitats that had become isolated. Then, when the water falls again, the entire community reshuffles. Species that were waiting in mud, seed banks, burrows, or sheltered pools begin their next chapter. A healthy swamp is often far more resilient than it appears. It bends, burns, drains, refills, and reorganizes. Instead of ending, it responds. Sometimes what looks like ruin is simply the beginning of its next form. A single swamp can feed fish, birds, reptiles, insects, and mammals. That richness begins with plants, algae, and drifting particles of life too small to notice at a glance. Sunlight hits the water. Leaves fall from trees. Microbes begin breaking them down. Insects feed on that material, then become food for fish, frogs, and spiders. Small fish are eaten by larger fish, herons, otters, snakes, and alligators. Fruits and seeds feed turtles, ducks, and mammals that move along the edges. Even animals that never touch the water may depend on prey raised in it. In that sense, a swamp is not only a habitat. It is a kitchen, pantry, and delivery system all at once. Energy moves outward through hundreds of mouths, wings, claws, and scales. That is why the loss of one wetland can echo through an entire region. When a swamp feeds so many forms of life, it is never just serving itself. It is supporting a whole surrounding world. Swamps help tame floods by slowing water before it becomes disaster. When heavy rain falls on hard ground, water can rush onward with dangerous speed. It gathers in streets, fields, and rivers, then surges into towns and low country with destructive force. A swamp interrupts that rush. Water spreads into pools, channels, and vegetated shallows where its movement slows. Tree trunks, reeds, roots, and uneven ground all help hold it back. Some of that water sinks into the soil. Some is stored on the surface. Some is released later and more gradually. This does not make swamps magical shields against every storm, but it does make them natural moderators of extremes. Their value becomes clearest when they are gone. Places that once absorbed overflow may instead send it onward. A landscape can lose its sponge and keep only the rush. That is one reason wetland destruction often proves expensive in ways people never intended. Remove the swamp, and the flood may begin acting very differently. Some swamps formed where ancient seas retreated and water stayed behind. That origin gives certain wetlands a deep and dramatic past. Imagine a coastline shifting over immense spans of time. Sea levels change. Sediment builds. The water withdraws from ground it once covered. Yet the land left behind does not always become dry and stable. In flat regions, water can linger in shallow basins, old channels and low plains. Fresh water arrives from rain and rivers. Plants colonize the wet ground. Trees, peat, and tangled habitats gradually develop. What remains is a swamp with a memory of an older world beneath it. Sometimes the evidence survives in the shape of the land. Sometimes it appears in buried sediments, ancient shells, or the chemistry of the soil. That history matters because it reminds us that swamps are not accidents or leftovers. They are chapters in the long story of changing coasts, shifting climates, and landscapes that keep transforming long after the sea has moved on. Beneath swamp mud, life keeps working where oxygen almost disappears. To us, low oxygen sounds like the edge of survival. To many microbes, it is simply another way to live. In swamp sediments, where water blocks the easy flow of air, vast communities carry on chemical work that shapes the whole wetland. Different microbes use different compounds as they break down dead material. Some help release nutrients back into the system. Some influence the formation of gases like methane. Some alter the chemistry of iron, sulfur, and nitrogen in ways that affect plants growing above them. This hidden labor is one reason swamp mud matters so much. It is not inert sludge. It is active ground, full of organisms performing processes that most people never see and few ever think about. The result is a wetland powered not only by visible life, but by invisible partnerships below. In swamps, the unseen world is not secondary. It helps decide how the entire landscape functions. Many creatures people fear most are actually masters of swamp survival. Swamps often carry a dramatic reputation because they are associated with animals that trigger human unease. Snakes vanish into water without a ripple. Alligators wait with their eyes above the surface. Spiders build in the reeds. Insects hum in the heat. Yet these creatures are not symbols of menace in any meaningful ecological sense. They are specialists, each fitted to a place where patience, camouflage, and timing matter. An alligator can endure heat and drought by retreating to water and mud. A water snake can move through roots and shallows with astonishing efficiency. Predators that make people nervous often help keep swamp food webs balanced by controlling prey populations or removing weaker animals. Their presence is a sign that the wetland still functions as a complete system. Fear can flatten them into monsters. Attention restores what they really are, which is a set of highly refined answers to life in difficult terrain. Cypress knees still puzzle scientists who study flooded forests. These strange wooden knobs rise from the water, and mud around bald cypress trees, like a circle of silent sentries. For generations, people have wondered what they are truly for. One idea is that they help with support in soft ground. Another suggests they may play some role in moving gases in places where roots are buried in soaked, oxygen-poor soil. Scientists have tested, measured, and debated them, yet no single explanation has settled every case. That uncertainty makes them especially fascinating. Swamps are not only places where we find answers. They are places where old mysteries still stand in plain sight. You can paddle past a cypress trunk and see dozens of these growths pushing above the surface, each one a reminder that even familiar landscapes keep secrets. In an age of satellites and sensors, a swamp tree can still pose a question nobody has fully solved. Mangrove swamps can stand between storms and the people behind them. Along tropical coasts, mangroves form thick living barriers where land and sea meet. Their roots tangle into walls that catch sediment, break waves, and force rushing water to lose energy before it can strike inland with full strength. During storms, that resistance can matter enormously. It does not erase danger, but it can reduce erosion, blunt storm surge, and help protect homes, fields, and freshwater supplies farther behind the shore. What makes this even more remarkable is that the barrier is alive. It grows, spreads, repairs itself, and supports nurseries for fish, crabs, and countless other creatures at the same time. A concrete wall performs one job. A mangrove swamp performs many. Where these forests are cleared, coasts often become more exposed and more fragile. Where they survive, they offer a form of protection built not by engineers alone, but by roots, tides, and patient growth over years. Peat swamps preserve old pollen like tiny time capsules of vanished worlds. Every flowering season leaves behind a dusting of microscopic evidence. Pollen grains drift through the air, settle on water, and sink into soft peat where layers build slowly over long spans of time. In the right conditions, those grains can remain preserved for centuries or even millennia. When scientists extract cores from a peat swamp, they are reading a history written in particles too small to see with the naked eye. Different plants produce distinctive pollen, so each layer reveals which species once grew nearby. That means a swamp can tell us when forests shifted, when climates became wetter or drier, and when humans began altering the surrounding land. It is an extraordinary thought. A wetland that seems rooted in the present is also an archive of lost landscapes. Deep below today's trees, buried grains can still whisper the names of worlds that disappeared before anyone alive was born. Swamp water often looks dark because leaves steep it like tea. That rich brown color can make a wetland seem murky or even mysterious, yet the darkness often comes from an everyday process. As leaves, bark, and other plant materials soak and slowly break down, they release tannins into the water. These are the same kinds of compounds that can color brewed tea, though in swamps the effect can spread through whole channels, pools, and flooded forests. Light behaves differently in that stained water. Visibility drops. Shadows deepen. Fish, roots, and drifting shapes appear and disappear with a kind of theatrical slowness. The color can also influence heat and chemistry in subtle ways, shaping which organisms thrive there. To people unfamiliar with blackwater wetlands, the darkness may suggest pollution or decay alone. In reality, it often signals a functioning natural system rich in leaf litter and plant processes. A swamp can look almost like brewed earth, and that appearance tells a story. Alligators engineer wetlands simply by digging and waiting through drought. When water levels fall, survival can depend on the deepest places left behind. In parts of the American Southeast, alligators create exactly those refuges by hollowing out depressions called gator holes. These pits hold water longer than the surrounding marsh or swamp surface, and that changes everything during dry periods. Fish, turtles, frogs, insects, and wading birds all gather around the remaining pools. Plants at the edges can differ from those farther away because the water lasts longer there. Nutrients concentrate. Movement increases. Life reorganizes around a space made by one powerful reptile, using little more than its body and persistence. Then, when rains return, the influence of that whole can spread outward again. This is why alligators are often described as ecosystem engineers. They do not just live in wetlands. They reshape them in ways that help many other species endure hard seasons, often without human observers noticing at all. Some swamp trees breathe through roots that rise above the water. In certain flooded habitats, roots do something that seems almost backward. Instead of hiding below ground, they push upward into the air. These structures, called pneumatophores in some species, act like snorkels for the root system. They allow gases to move between the atmosphere and tissues trapped in waterlogged soil where oxygen is scarce. The result is a tree adapted to one of the hardest challenges in wet ground, which is simply getting enough air below the surface. In a mangrove swamp, these upward roots can create entire fields of spikes around the trunks, transforming the shoreline into a landscape that looks almost designed by another planet. Walking there means stepping through a forest that is breathing in public. The sight is both practical and astonishing. A problem that would kill many plants is answered not with retreat, but with a new architecture, one that turns breathing itself into something visible. Swamps can filter pollution before it reaches rivers, lakes, and coasts. As water moves through a wetland, it often slows enough for suspended sediment to settle out. Lev alone can make a major difference downstream, but the process goes further. Swamp soils, plants, and microbial communities can trap, transform, or absorb certain nutrients and contaminants moving across the landscape. Excess nitrogen, phosphorus, and other materials may be reduced before they fuel algal blooms or degrade waters beyond the wetland. Roots create surfaces where microbes can do important chemical work. Mud stores particles that might otherwise stay in motion. Vegetation intercepts runoff and changes how it moves. This does not mean swamps can safely swallow unlimited pollution. They have limits, and severe contamination can damage them badly. Yet under healthier conditions, they function as living treatment systems that work constantly and quietly. The benefit often extends far beyond the wetland itself, because cleaner water leaving a swamp can support healthier fisheries, estuaries, and communities downstream. Carnivorous plants thrive in swamps where the soil offers little nutrition. In some wetlands, the ground is wet but strangely poor. Water can wash away or lock up nutrients that many plants need, which creates a harsh botanical challenge. Carnivorous plants answer that problem with one of the most dramatic strategies in the living world. Instead of relying only on the soil, they supplement their diet by capturing small animals, usually insects. Pitcher plants lure prey into deep fluid-filled traps. Sundews use sticky droplets that glisten like nectar, but behave like glue. Venus flytraps close with startling speed after sensitive trigger hairs are touched in the right pattern. These are not monsters of the plant kingdom. They are elegant solutions to scarcity. In nutrient-poor swamps, they turn hunger into invention. That is part of their enduring fascination. A wetland can seem overflowing with life, yet some of its most famous plants evolved there because the ground itself was never generous enough. Spanish moss is not moss, and swamps helped make that famous. Those long grey streamers hanging from branches in southern wetlands are so iconic that many people never question the name. Yet Spanish moss is not a moss at all. It is a flowering plant in the bromeliad family, related more closely to pineapples than to the soft green mats that usually come to mind when we hear the word moss. It does not parasitize the trees it drapes from either. Instead, it uses them for support while drawing moisture and nutrients from rain, dust, and the air around it. Swamps and humid forests made this plant visually unforgettable. because it thrives where the atmosphere often stays moist enough for its unusual lifestyle. Over time, it became part of the popular image of these wetlands themselves. What looks like a decorative fringe on the forest is actually a clever air-living plant, with its own strategy, its own lineage, and a name that hides almost everything true about it. Frogs in swamps can turn whole nights into living soundscapes. After sunset, many wetlands stop looking busy and start sounding immense. Frogs take over the dark with calls that can click, trill, croak, peep, or boom depending on the species. Each voice has a purpose. Males advertise for mates, mark space, and compete with neighbors in choruses that may rise and fall for hours. To human ears, the combined effect can feel almost orchestral. One species may carry the rhythm. Another adds sharp notes from the margins. A deeper call rolls across open water, while finer sounds shimmer in the reeds. For the animals involved, this is serious work shaped by timing, weather, water levels, and breeding urgency. For us, it can be one of the most unforgettable experiences a swamp offers. You are hearing a wetland announce that it is alive. Even without seeing a single frog, you can sense the scale of the hidden community through sound alone. The Everglades is a slow river, not a motionless marsh. Many people imagine the Everglades as a soggy wilderness that simply sits in place, but its real identity is movement. Water once spread south from Lake Okeechobee in a broad, shallow sheet, flowing so slowly that the motion could be hard to notice with human eyes. That is why the place has often been called a river of grass. It behaves less like a lake and more like a living current, passing through sawgrass plains, tree islands, sloughs, and coastal estuaries. The speed is modest, yet the consequences are enormous. That slow flow decides where nutrients travel, where fish gather, where birds feed, and where fresh water pushes back against the sea. When canals, levees, and pumps interrupt that ancient motion, the whole system changes. To understand the Everglades, you have to stop picturing stillness and start picturing a landscape made by water that never truly stops moving. Ughranoki means trembling earth, which suits its floating peat islands. The name feels almost poetic, yet it describes a real physical sensation. In parts of the Okefenokee, mats of peat and vegetation can float over dark water, creating islands that shift, quiver, or subtly respond beneath weight and motion. Step onto the wrong surface and the ground may feel less like land than a raft woven from roots, mosses, and centuries of partially decayed plant matter. That makes the swamp feel uncannily alive, as though the earth itself has not decided whether it wants to be solid or fluid. These floating formations can support shrubs and trees, drift over time, and reshape the map of the wetland in ways that frustrate simple boundaries. The result is a landscape that seems to wobble between categories. It is not quite firm ground, yet it is not open water either. Few places make the phrase living landscape feel more literal than a swamp, where the soil itself can tremble. Swamp peat can lock away carbon for thousands of years. Peat forms when dead plant material accumulates faster than it fully decomposes, and over long stretches of time that slow buildup becomes a vast underground storehouse. In wet conditions, the remains of roots, leaves, wood, and other organic matter are not completely recycled at the pace they would be in drier ground. Instead, they pile up in dense, dark layers that preserve carbon captured from the atmosphere long ago. Some peat deposits are surprisingly old, holding the remains of vegetation that lived through climates very different from our own. That turns a swamp into more than a present-day habitat. It becomes a reservoir of ancient biological history and a major player in the global carbon cycle. The remarkable part is how quiet the process appears from above. While birds call and water moves past cypress trunks, the ground below may be holding a record of centuries, built one leaf and one stem at a time. Methane bubbling from swamp mud links wetlands to the planet's climate. Sometimes the connection rises right to the surface in plain sight. A bubble swells through dark water, pops and disappears, yet it carries a story with global significance. In oxygen-poor swamp sediments, certain microbes break down organic matter in ways that produce methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. That means wetlands are not only places that store carbon, they are also sources of gases that influence the atmosphere. This balance is one reason swamps matter so much in climate science. Temperature, water levels, plant communities, and soil conditions all affect how much methane is produced and released. Some may escape through open water, some can move through plants themselves. Scientists study these processes closely because wetlands are both stabilizers and participants in Earth's climate system. A swamp is not outside that planetary conversation. It is part of it, right down to the invisible chemistry unfolding beneath a layer of mud. Some fish survive swamp droughts by breathing air above the surface. When shallow wetlands begin to shrink under heat and dry weather, oxygen levels in the remaining water can fall dangerously low. For many fish, that would be the beginning of the end. Yet a few species have evolved an extraordinary backup plan. They rise to the surface and dope air directly. In North America, bowfins and gars are famous examples of fish that can tolerate harsh, stagnant conditions that would kill less adaptable species. Their bodies allow them to supplement ordinary gill breathing with access to atmospheric oxygen, which gives them a huge advantage when swamp pools become warm, crowded, and depleted. This ability changes the drama of drought. As the water contracts, some fish are not merely trapped victims. They become survivors equipped for a crisis that returns again and again. In a shrinking swamp, the simple act of breaking the surface can mark the difference between collapse and endurance. Mudskippers turn swamp edges into stages for walking fish. At the margins of tropical mangroves and tidal flats, these remarkable fish perform one of the strangest acts in vertebrate life. They leave the water and move across wet mud, using muscular fins in a way that looks almost like a crude form of walking. Their eyes sit high on the head, scanning the world above the surface. They breathe partly through moist skin and the lining of the mouth and throat, provided they stay damp enough. On land, they feed, court, defend territory, and interact in a zone where fish are not supposed to be so comfortable. Watching one scramble over exposed mud feels like glimpsing a distant echo of the deep past, when vertebrate life was first experimenting with the boundary between water and land. Mudskippers are not our ancestors in any direct sense, but they make that ancient threshold visible. They turn a swamp edge into a living demonstration of possibility. Swamps gave early human communities food, transport, shelter, and trade routes. To many modern eyes, wetlands can seem inconvenient or forbidding, yet for countless people in the past, they were practical landscapes full of opportunity. Fish, shellfish, turtles, birds, edible plants, and game animals could all be gathered from swamp environments. Reeds, wood, fibers, and mud provided materials for baskets, homes, tools, fuel, and watercraft. In flat country, waterways often served as natural roads, allowing movement and exchange where dense forest or difficult ground might slow travel over land. Settlements near wetlands could draw on a broad range of resources through changing seasons, and some communities became highly skilled at reading flood cycles, channels, and spawning times. Far from being edges of civilization, many swamps were part of its foundation. They fed people, connected places, and rewarded careful local knowledge. What looks to one era like wasteland may have been another era's pantry, workshop, and highway at once. Ancient wooden roads were laid across boggy swamps long before modern engineering. People have been solving wet ground problems for a very long time, and some of their solutions still astonish archaeologists. In parts of prehistoric Europe, communities built timber trackways across bogs and swamps using laid logs, planks, brushwood, and carefully arranged supports. These routes allowed movement across landscapes that might otherwise swallow carts, animals, or travelers in deep mud. Some trackways stretch for impressive distances and required major collective effort to build and maintain. Their remains survive because waterlogged conditions can preserve wood far better than dry ground in many cases. That preservation turns a swamp into a vault of human ingenuity. You are not only finding old timber, you are finding evidence of planning, labor, and a decision to connect one place to another, despite difficult terrain. Long before asphalt and concrete, people were already engineering passage through wetlands with skill, persistence, and an understanding of the landscape. Mosquitoes find swamp life ideal, but so do many predators. Wetlands are famous for mosquitoes, and that reputation is well earned. Standing water and shallow pools can provide perfect breeding sites where eggs hatch and larvae develop before taking wing. Yet the full story is more interesting than a simple explosion of biting insects. Those same watery nurseries also feed a wide range of predators. Fish consume larvae from below. Dragonfly nymphs seize them underwater. Beetles, backswimmers, frogs, birds, bats, and spiders all take advantage of mosquitoes at one stage or another. In a healthy swamp, they are not just pests. They are also prey woven into a much larger food web. Their abundance can help sustain animals people admire far more than the insects themselves. That does not make their bites any more welcome, but it does place them in context. Even the most annoying residents of a wetland often occupy an essential role in keeping energy moving through the system. Dragonflies hunt about swamps with flight skills older than birds. A dragonfly over dark water can seem almost mechanical in its precision. It hovers, accelerates, brakes, swivels, and changes direction with a control that still impresses engineers who study flight. These insects are aerial predators of astonishing skill, catching other insects on the wing with large eyes, specialized legs, and powerful, independently controlled wings. Their lineage is ancient, reaching far back before birds ever appeared. That depth of time adds something wonderful to the sight of one patrolling a swamp channel today. You are watching a hunter built on a very old design, refined across immense stretches of evolution. The story becomes even richer when you remember that dragonflies begin life underwater as nymphs, where they are predators there as well. A swamp gives them both worlds, first the submerged one, then the air above it. Few animals embody the linked realms of wetland life more beautifully than dragonflies do. Swamps can create floating islands held together by living roots. In some wetlands, the ground is not truly ground at all. Plants grow outward over water, their roots tangling with fallen stems, moss, and half-decayed matter, until a buoyant mat begins to form. Over time, that mat can thicken enough to support shrubs, then grasses, then even small trees. What looks like a stable island may actually be floating, rising and sinking with water levels, shifting position in storms, and flexing under its own living weight. These islands are not built in a single moment. They are assembled slowly by growth, decay, and constant weaving from below. That makes them feel almost improbable, like landscapes stitched together rather than laid down. For animals, they offer shelter, nesting space, and stepping stones through open water. For people, they challenge basic assumptions about land itself. A swamp can produce a place you can stand on, even when the world beneath it never truly stops being water. Blackwater swamps may look murky, yet they can be chemically delicate. Dark water often gives the impression of toughness, as though a swamp stained almost black must be rough, dirty, and chemically blunt. The opposite can be true. In many blackwater systems, the water is actually low in nutrients and surprisingly sensitive to change. Acids released from decaying plant material can lower the pH. Dissolved minerals may remain scarce. Light penetration shifts, productivity changes, and entire communities become adapted to conditions that are narrow and exacting rather than ruggedly indifferent. That means a swamp that looks heavy and opaque may in fact be finely balanced. Add too many nutrients from runoff, alter the flow, or change the surrounding vegetation, and the chemistry can move in ways that transform the whole system. Fish, amphibians, microbes, and plants all respond. The lesson is almost philosophical. Appearance misleads. A dark swamp can look like something coarse and durable, while functioning more like a carefully tuned instrument. Tannins from swamp plants can change water color, chemistry, and light. When leaves and bark soak in wetland water, they release compounds that do far more than stain the surface brown. Tannins can alter how sunlight travels through the water, softening brightness, reducing visibility, and changing the way heat is absorbed. They also influence chemistry, often making conditions more acidic and affecting which organisms flourish there. For fish and invertebrates, that can mean a world shaped by dimmer sightlines and different chemical thresholds. For predators and prey, it changes the drama of movement, hiding, and detection. Even photographers and naturalists notice it instantly because the water seems to hold shadows inside it. Yet this is not merely a visual effect. It is part of how a swamp operates. Plant matter enters the water and begins reshaping the environment in subtle but powerful ways. A fallen leaf does not only decay. In a wetland, it can help rewrite the character of the water around it. Some swamp orchids bloom in places that flood for months. Orchids already seem improbable to many people, yet swamp orchids add another layer of surprise by thriving where roots may stand in saturated ground for long stretches of the year. These plants occupy niches that would overwhelm less specialized species, timing growth and flowering to conditions that can shift dramatically with seasonal water. Some emerge from open wet prairies or swamp edges in sudden bursts of color that seem almost unreal against dark water and sedges. Others depend on very specific hydrology, light levels, and fungal relationships in the soil, making them both beautiful and precarious. That combination is part of the fascination. A place many imagine as muddy and monotonous can produce some of the most intricate flowers in the plant world. Their presence also reminds us that swamps are not only about endurance and toughness. They can also be arenas of startling delicacy, where exquisite forms appear because the conditions are difficult, not despite it. Bold cypress trees can outlive empires while standing in swamp water. There is something almost mythic about a tree that spends centuries with its base in floodwater and still keeps growing. Bald cypress can do exactly that. Some individuals have lived for many hundreds of years, surviving storms, changing river courses, and generations of human history that rose and vanished around them. Their wood resists rot. Their form holds steady in difficult ground. Year after year, they add growth rings, recording seasons of flood, drought, and fire in a body that becomes both organism and archive. To stand before an old cypress is to face a living witness. It may have been rooted there long before nearby towns existed. It may still be there long after current roads, politics, and property lines are forgotten. Swamps often feel ancient because of trees like these. They give wetland time a different scale, one measured not in headlines or lifetimes, but in centuries of patient endurance. Swamps often protect young fish better than open water ever could. For a newly hatched fish, open water can be a dangerous place filled with hungry mouths and nowhere to hide. Swamps offer a different beginning. Roots, stems, submerged branches, and dense vegetation create a maze of cover that larger predators cannot easily penetrate. Water may be shallow, warmer in places, and rich with tiny food sources such as plankton, insect larvae, and organic particles. That combination makes wetland nurseries especially valuable during early life stages, when small fish need both shelter and steady feeding opportunities. Many species that later move into rivers, lakes, or coastal waters depend on swampy habitat while young, even if adults spend little time there. In that sense, swamps act as protective classrooms, where vulnerable life gets its first real chance. Remove those sheltered places, and survival rates can fall long before anyone notices fewer adult fish in the waters beyond. The nursery may be hidden, but its effects travel widely. Wading birds rely on falling swamp water to trap prey. A swamp in high water can scatter fish and invertebrates across a broad flooded landscape. For herons, egrets, ibises, spoonbills, and storks, that is not always ideal. Hunting becomes easier when the water begins to drop. As pools shrink and channels narrow, prey concentrates into smaller spaces, and the birds know it. Suddenly, a wetland that seemed loosely populated can turn into a feeding ground crowded with white wings, stabbing bills, and deliberate steps through the shallows. Timing is everything. Nesting seasons in some regions are closely linked to these changes because adults need dense, predictable food supplies to raise young successfully. That means the rhythm of water level is not background scenery. It is the schedule that determines whether entire colonies thrive or struggle. A few inches of decline can reorganize the food web. In swamps, falling water is not simply loss. For many birds, it is the moment the feast begins. In dry seasons, shrinking swamps can become crowded theaters of survival. As water retreats, space tightens, and the wetland changes character almost day by day. Creatures that were once spread across broad habitat begin converging in the remaining pools, channels, and damp hollows. Fish circle in denser schools. Turtles stack on logs or push toward deeper water. Predators arrive because prey is easier to find. Birds gather in impressive numbers. Competition sharpens. Escape routes narrow. What had seemed vast and forgiving becomes intimate and tense. This compression creates some of the most dramatic scenes in wetland life, not because the swamp has failed, but because seasonality is part of its design. Survival during these periods often depends on timing, mobility, and tolerance for worsening conditions. Some species endure. Some retreat into mud or burrows. Some seize the opportunity to feed. The result is a landscape turned into a stage where every remaining pocket of water matters, and every animal must make choices quickly. Some swamp snails climb upward to escape changing water levels. It is easy to overlook snails in a wetland, yet their behavior can be surprisingly dynamic. In certain swamps and marshy edges, snails respond to rising or falling water by moving up stems, trunks, and vegetation. This simple upward crawl can help them avoid drowning in water with poor oxygen, escape aquatic predators, or position themselves for changing conditions around temperature and moisture. For birds such as snail specialists, those movements can influence where food becomes available. For the snails themselves, climbing is a practical answer to a world that refuses to stay constant. Wetlands reward flexibility even at very small scales. A creature with no dramatic speed and no obvious power still survives by reading its environment well. That is one of the pleasures of looking closely at swamps. Even the quietest residents are not passive. They are making decisions, adjusting to pulses of water, and participating in the same larger rhythms as everything else. Wetland soils can grow so slowly that history sinks into them layer by layer. A swamp floor is often built from patience. Leaves fall, roots die, stems collapse, and fine sediments settle from water so gently that the accumulation may seem almost negligible in any single year. Yet over long spans, those tiny additions create layered soils that preserve a slow record of the past. Seeds, ash, pollen, charcoal, shell fragments, and organic remains become buried in sequence, each layer marking a different moment in the life of the wetland and the landscape around it. Disturb the ground and you may reveal not just mud, but a time mine. Fire years, flood years, drought years, and periods of human activity can all leave traces in the accumulating material. What makes this so striking is the pace. Swamps are often associated with abundance and motion, yet beneath that busy surface lies a process so gradual that centuries can pass while the archive quietly thickens. History does not vanish there. It settles. Swamp sediments record storms, fires, droughts, and lost forests. A swamp floor can function like a memory that never learned how to speak aloud. Each flood may lay down a fresh pulse of silt. Each fire may leave a dusting of charcoal. Each drought can alter what grows, what dies, and what settles into the mud afterward. Over long stretches of time, those traces build into a layered record that scientists can read like a biography of changing weather and changing land. A buried band of ash might mark an ancient burn. Pollen can reveal which trees once stood nearby before the forest shifted or vanished. Sand may hint at powerful storms that pushed material inland. None of this survives as a written account, yet the evidence remains underfoot. That is part of what makes swamps so extraordinary. They are alive in the present, while quietly storing the signatures of vanished events, including whole landscapes that no longer exist above the surface at all. A swamp can begin when a lake slowly fills itself with plants. What seems permanent in nature often has a long and patient ending. A lake may start as open water with wide views and wind on its surface, yet over time, the shallows invite reeds, lilies, sedges, and other plants to take hold. Their stems slow water. Their roots trap sediment. Their dead remains settle and build new layers on the bottom. Bit by bit, the lake becomes shallower. More vegetation advances. Patches of open water shrink into pockets and channels. In some places, shrubs and trees arrive, and a wet forest begins, where waves once moved freely. This transformation can take centuries, which makes it easy to miss in a human lifetime, but the direction is real. A swamp is not always something that was simply there from the start. Sometimes it is a later chapter in the life of a water body, created by growth itself, patiently rewriting the landscape. Beavers can create swampy habitat simply by changing how water moves. Few animals reshape land with such immediate effect. A beaver does not need heavy machinery, maps, or grand plans. It cuts wood, piles branches, seals gaps with mud, and lets physics take over. Water slows behind the dam. Channels spread outward. Soil becomes saturated. Trees may die standing as roots drown. Open pools appear where dry ground or narrow streams once dominated. Soon the place begins to function differently. Frogs breed in the new water. Insects multiply. Waterfowl visit. Fish, amphibians, and mammals take advantage of altered conditions. The astonishing thing is that this new wetland can arise from repeated local decisions by a rodent following instinct. Beaver engineering is not decorative. It can convert an entire valley bottom into a mosaic of ponds, mud, meadow, and swampy forest. In a remarkably short span, one species can change the shape, depth, and rhythm of a whole living system. Forested swamps and marshes may seem alike, but they work differently. At a glance, both are wetlands with standing water, rich life, and soggy ground, so it is easy to blur them together. Yet the difference matters. Marshes are usually dominated by grasses, sedges, reeds, and other low-growing plants. Forested swamps are shaped by trees and shrubs that rise above the water and create vertical structure, shade, woody habitat, and a different pattern of roots and falling litter. That changes almost everything. Light reaches the surface differently. Birds use the space in different ways. Fish and invertebrates encounter different shelter. Decomposition follows different paths because leaves, wood, and herbaceous plants do not enter the system in the same proportions. Even the soundscape changes. A marsh often feels open and wind-brushed, while a swamp can feel enclosed and layered. Both are wetlands, but they are not interchangeable. To confuse them is a little like confusing a meadow with a forest, simply because both grow on land. Some swamps are freshwater worlds, while others pulse with ocean tides. Not all swamps obey the same clock. Inland freshwater swamps may rise and fall with rain, river overflow, or seasonal groundwater changes. Coastal swamps near the sea answer to another rhythm entirely. Tides push and pull through channels, bringing daily shifts in water depth, salinity, and movement. That tidal pulse transforms the habitat. Animals must cope with regular change. Plant communities organize themselves around how often salt water arrives and how long it lingers. Nutrients, sediments, larvae, and organic matter move in and out with a repeating breath that links the swamp to estuaries and open coast. By contrast, a freshwater swamp may feel more insulated, more dependent on weather and upstream flow than on the moon's pull. Both are swamps, yet they live by different schedules. One listens mainly to rain and river. The other listens every day to the sea itself, rising and retreating. Mangrove roots can trap land that rivers are trying to lose. Where rivers meet the coast, land is never entirely secure. Currents carry sediment away. Waves bite at shorelines. Storms rearrange mudbanks and channels with startling speed. In that unstable zone, mangrove roots act like living nets. Their tangled structures slow water enough for suspended particles to drop out and accumulate. Silt, clay, and organic matter collect between the roots instead of being swept onward. Over time, that process can build or stabilize ground that might otherwise erode away. It is a remarkable partnership between plant form and moving sediment. The mangroves hold the material. The material helps support more mangroves. Bit by bit, a shoreline that seemed doomed to unravel can persist or even expand. This is one reason mangrove loss can be so costly. Remove the root network, and the coast may begin giving way much faster. A mangrove swamp is not merely growing on land. Often, it is helping create it. Saltwater swamps challenge plants with thirst, even while roots stay wet. This sounds like a contradiction, yet it is one of the great paradoxes of coastal wetlands. Salt surrounds the roots, but that does not mean water is easy to use. High salinity makes it harder for plants to draw water into their tissues, so a root system can sit in soaked ground while the plant still experiences intense physiological stress. In effect, The water is present, but difficult to drink. That challenge shapes the whole community. Some plants exclude salt at the root surface. Others store it, shed it, or dilute it through specialized tissues. Leaves may become thick, waxy, or otherwise adapted to reduce water loss. Growth forms change. Species sort themselves according to how much salt and tidal flooding they can endure. What looks lush from a distance is actually a hard-won balance. A coastal swamp teaches a strange lesson. Abundance of water does not always mean relief. Sometimes it means another kind of struggle entirely. Mangroves can filter salt, store carbon, and shelter baby sharks. It is hard to think of many plant communities with a job description this varied. Mangroves are coastal specialists that deal with salt in sophisticated ways, depending on the species. Some exclude much of it before it enters the plant. Some excrete it through leaves. At the same time, their tangled root systems slow sediment, support food webs, and help bury organic material in waterlogged soils where carbon can remain stored for long periods. Then, there is the animal story. Those same roots create intricate underwater shelter used by juvenile fish, crustaceans, and in some regions young sharks seeking protection from larger predators. The nursery function is especially striking because it reveals how architecture matters in nature. A maze of submerged roots can mean the difference between exposure and survival. So within one swamp forest, you find salt management, climate importance, shoreline stabilization, and a refuge for young predators. Few ecosystems multitask with such quiet brilliance. Crocodiles and alligators both use swamps, but not in the same ways. People often blur these reptiles together, yet their ecology can differ in important ways. Alligators are strongly associated with freshwater wetlands and are especially famous in swamps, marshes, and slow-moving inland waters of the southeastern United States and parts of China. Crocodiles, depending on the species, often show greater tolerance for brackish or saltier environments and may use estuaries, coastal mangroves, river mouths, and tidal wetlands more readily. Their bodies, behavior, and ranges reflect those differences. Even where their habitats overlap, they are not simply duplicates of one another. Snout shape, salt handling, nesting tendencies, and territorial patterns can vary. And those distinctions influence how each animal fits into a wetland system. Understanding the difference matters because swamps are not occupied by generic top predators. They are shaped by particular species with particular tolerances. One reptile may prefer the inland freshwater maze, while another is better suited to the shifting edge of sea and swamp. Swamp turtles survive harsh seasons by slowing their bodies dramatically. When a wetland turns cold, dries down, or otherwise becomes difficult, some turtles respond not by fleeing far away, but by entering a state of profound economy. Their metabolism drops. Movement decreases. Heart rate and oxygen demand can fall as the body settles into survival mode. Depending on the species and the challenge, a turtle may bury into mud, shelter underwater, or wait in protected spots until conditions improve. This is not laziness or passivity. It is a physiological strategy that allows life to continue on very little. In some cases, turtles can tolerate periods of astonishing hardship through biochemical tricks that help them endure low oxygen and low activity. That ability suits the unpredictability of swamp living, where seasons can swing from abundance to stress with little ceremony. A turtle in a quiet pool may appear inactive, yet inside its body, a remarkable negotiation with time is taking place, buying endurance through stillness. Amphibians depend on swamps because eggs and skin both need moisture. For amphibians, a swamp is not just helpful habitat. It is often the difference between life and failure. Their eggs usually lack the hard protective shells that reptiles and birds rely on, so they must be laid in places where drying out is less likely. Their skin creates another challenge, because it is thin, permeable, and closely involved in breathing and water balance. That means moisture is not a luxury. It is built into how their bodies work. Swamps answer that need with shaded pools, damp leaf litter, flooded hollows, and humid air that softens the danger of drying. Frogs, toads, salamanders, and other amphibians may use different parts of the wetland at different stages of life, moving between water and land, while always depending on the wetness around them. A swamp becomes nursery, refuge, and breathing space all at once. In many cases, without that persistent moisture, the life cycle simply cannot continue. Some swamp insects spend years underwater before taking wing. A dragonfly or mayfly flashing over a wetland can seem like a creature of pure air and sunlight, yet for some species, the greater part of life happens below the surface first. Eggs hatch underwater. Nymphs or larvae spend months or even years hunting, hiding, and growing among roots, mud, stems, and sunken leaves. In that submerged world, they are not fragile future adults. They are already active predators or grazers, equipped for a completely different existence. Then comes the astonishing transition. At the right moment, the insect climbs out onto a stem or trunk. The body splits. Wings unfold. A creature shaped by water becomes one shaped by air. Swamps are perfect stages for this transformation because they offer both realms at once. The same wetland that raises underwater young also provides the launch point for flight. Few places show metamorphosis so vividly or make the border between worlds seem so beautifully thin. Fire can reset a swamp and open space for new life. It sounds wrong at first. We picture swamps as the opposite of flame, yet in many wetland systems fire has long been part of the rhythm. During drier periods, grasses, shrubs, and exposed organic matter can burn, clearing dense growth that would otherwise choke light from the ground. The result can be dramatic. Nutrients return to the surface. Seedlings get access to sun. Open patches appear where crowded vegetation had begun to dominate. Certain plants are so tied to this cycle, but they flourish only when fire keeps the landscape from closing in around them. Some animal species also benefit when new feeding areas and fresh plant growth follow a burn. Of course, not every fire is healthy, and severe modern fires can be deeply destructive. Yet in the right context, fire is not simply an enemy of wetlands. It can act as a reset, making room for a new phase of life to begin. In some regions, swamps burn underground when peat dries out. This is one of the strangest and most unsettling forms of fire in nature. Instead of racing only across the surface, the burn can slip downward into dried peat, where it smolders through packed layers of old plant material. That means the fire is feeding on the swamp's own accumulated history. It may travel slowly, invisibly, and stubbornly through the ground itself, producing smoke for long periods and proving difficult to extinguish. Surface flames can pass, yet the deeper combustion may continue beneath the wetland long after the obvious blaze seems gone. These fires can damage root systems, release stored carbon, and transform the land in ways that last for years. Their existence is a powerful reminder that a swamp's wetness is not guaranteed. When drainage, drought, or heat strips enough water away, the very soil can become fuel. A place built over centuries can begin burning from the inside out. Swamps can smell rich and earthy because microbes are always at work. That deep wetland smell is more than atmosphere. It is chemistry made noticeable. Beneath the surface, microbes are constantly breaking down leaves, wood, roots, and other organic remains. In doing so, they release compounds that drift into the air and give swamps their distinctive scent, part soil, part water, part slow transformation. The smell can shift from sweet to sour, from fresh to almost smoky or mineral, depending on season, flooding, temperature, and what is decomposing at the time. To many people, it feels ancient at once, as though the swamp is breathing out the memory of everything that has fallen into it. What makes this especially fascinating is that the scent signals activity, not stillness. A swamp may look quiet if its microbial communities are busy dismantling the dead and reshaping matter into forms the rest of the ecosystem can use. Even the air above the water carries evidence of that hidden labor. Decomposition slows in swamps, which helps unusual things survive for ages. In many places, fallen leaves, dead animals, and abandoned objects are broken down quickly by oxygen-rich conditions and a host of hungry organisms. Swamps often change that pace. Waterlogged ground can limit oxygen, reduce the activity of certain decomposers, and create conditions where decay proceeds much more slowly. That slowdown can preserve things that would vanish elsewhere. Plant fibers, wooden tools, seeds, skin, hair, and traces of entire organisms may persist far longer than anyone would expect. The wetland becomes not just a place of growth, but a place of delay, where time works differently on the remains of life. This is one reason archaeologists and paleoecologists value certain swamps so highly. They sometimes hold fragile evidence that ordinary soil would destroy. A lost object dropped into dark water may not simply rot away. It may wait, hidden and protected, until some future moment brings it back into the light. Whole trees can fall into swamps and vanish beneath patient water. In a dry forest, a fallen tree often remains visible for years as it decays in open air. In a swamp, the story can be very different. A trunk may topple into soft mud or dark water, sink gradually, and disappear beneath layers of silt, plant matter, and slow-moving sediment. From above, it is gone. Below, it begins another life as structure, shelter, and eventually buried material. Fish may use it for cover. Invertebrates colonize its surface. Fungi and microbes work through its wood at a slower pace than on dry land. Over time, more debris settles. The tree becomes part of the swamp's hidden architecture, then part of its history. There is something haunting about that process. A living giant can fall without spectacle and be absorbed so completely that later visitors never know it stood there. In swamps, disappearance is often not destruction. It is incorporation into a deeper layer of the place. Swamps have preserved bodies, tools, pollen, and even ancient footprints. Few landscapes hold the past with such strange generosity. In the right conditions, swampy ground can preserve not just broad environmental clues, but startlingly specific traces of lives once lived. Human remains have been found in waterlogged deposits, with skin, hair, and clothing details still present after immense spans of time. Wooden objects, woven materials, and tools survive where ordinary soils would have erased them. Pollen grains keep records of vanished vegetation. Even footprints can remain impressed in ancient wet sediments, marking the passage of people or animals across surfaces that later hardened or were buried. What makes this so gripping is the intimacy of the evidence. A swamp may return not only a general story of the past, but the impression of a step, the shape of a hand-made object, the face of a person lost to history. It preserves moments that feel almost impossible to recover, then keeps them in darkness for centuries. Bogs and swamps are not the same, despite how often people mix them. The confusion is understandable because both are wet and often peaty, yet they operate by different rules. Swamps are wetlands dominated by trees or shrubs, and they usually receive significant water and nutrients from surface flow, rivers, floodwater, or groundwater. Bogs are typically more isolated from those sources and depend heavily on rain. That difference changes chemistry, fertility, and plant life in major ways. Bogs are often more acidic and nutrient-poor, which is why they favor mosses, specialized shrubs, and carnivorous plants rather than wetland forests. Swamps, by contrast, often support taller vegetation, woody structure, and a different kind of productivity. So although people may use the words loosely in everyday speech, the ecosystems themselves are not interchangeable. Calling a bog a swamp smooths over two very different ways of being wet. Nature uses more than one recipe for making a saturated landscape, and these are distinct creations. Swamp forests can migrate over centuries as water patterns slowly change. A forest seems rooted, permanent, and stubbornly fixed in place. Yet on the timescale of centuries, even a swamp forest can shift across the landscape. Changes in river channels, sediment buildup, rainfall, groundwater, sea level, or fire frequency can alter where wet conditions persist long enough for swamp trees to thrive. In one area, seedlings may fail as the ground dries or salt increases. In another, newly suitable wet soil may invite colonization and slow expansion. The result is a kind of migration too gradual for a single generation to notice clearly, but powerful when viewed across maps, cores, and old records. A swamp forest is not marching in dramatic steps. It is leaning, retreating, and advancing through time. That idea can feel almost eerie. The trees appear still, yet the community itself is moving. Even forests in standing water are not fixed forever. They follow water's long decisions. Some swamp birds nest over water to avoid land predators. For a bird raising helpless chicks, location is everything. In many swamps, the safest nursery is not hidden deep in a thicket on dry ground, but suspended above water where raccoons, foxes, snakes, and other land hunters face a far harder approach. Colonies of herons, egrets, ibises, and other water birds often gather in flooded trees and shrubs, turning whole sections of wetland into noisy seasonal cities. The water below acts like a moat, and the clustering of many nests adds extra vigilance because hundreds of sharp eyes notice danger faster than one pair alone. There is risk in this strategy too. Storms, changing water levels, and competition can all threaten a nesting colony. Yet the advantage is clear. A swamp gives birds a chance to build family life in a place that predators cannot easily cross. The same flooded world that challenges movement becomes, for a nestling, a form of protection. Swamps can cool local climates by storing water and releasing it slowly. A wetland changes more than the ground beneath your feet. It can also shade the air above it. Water absorbs heat more slowly than dry land and releases it more gradually, which helps soften temperature swings in nearby areas. Swamps also support dense vegetation that shades surfaces and returns moisture to the atmosphere through transpiration. Together, those effects can create cooler local conditions during hot periods and help reduce the harshness of sudden extremes. This does not mean a swamp feels cold. Many are warm, humid places. Yet without them, the surrounding landscape may heat faster, dry more quickly, and lose some of its natural buffering against weather. In that sense, a wetland behaves like a quiet moderator of local climate. It tempers the pace of change. A place full of standing water and rooted plants becomes part of the atmosphere's daily rhythm, shaping comfort, humidity, and heat in ways many people never notice. Water lilies can turn open swamp pools into shifting green rafts. At first, a few round leaves may seem decorative, almost fragile against the dark water. Then the patch expands. Leaf joins leaf. Stems rise from the bottom. Flowers open and close on their own schedule. Before long, an open pool begins to look roofed with green. Water lilies can transform the surface of a swamp into something that appears almost solid from a distance, though the living cover is always shifting with wind, current, growth, and decay. Underneath that floating canopy, light changes, temperature changes, and the behavior of fish, insects, and amphibians changes too. Some creatures find shelter in the shade. Others hunt along the edges where open water meets leaf cover. For people, the effect can feel uncanny. A pool that once showed dark reflections becomes patterned, crowded, and half-concealed. It is another reminder that swamps are never static. Even open water can be gradually rewritten by plants. Seed dispersal in swamps often depends on floods rather than wind. In dry landscapes, wind may carry seeds across fields and forests with elegant randomness. In swamps, moving water often takes over that job. Floods lift seeds, fruits, and fragments of plants and transport them through channels, across flats, and into fresh patches of mud where new growth can begin. Some seeds are built for floating. Others survive being carried in drifting debris or deposited as water rises and falls. This gives swamps a special kind of connectivity. A storm upstream or a seasonal flood pulse can redistribute the future of the plant community in a single event. What germinates next year may have arrived on water from far beyond sight. That makes the spread of vegetation feel dynamic and slightly mysterious. The swamp is not only growing from what already stands there, it is receiving arrivals. Floodwater becomes a delivery system for tomorrow's roots, leaves, and trunks, quietly rearranging the map of life as it moves. Catfish, gars, and bowfins thrive where murky water frustrates other hunters. In a clear stream, speed and sharp vision may decide who eats and who escapes. In a swamp, those rules change. Water can be cloudy with silt, stained dark with organic compounds, or crowded with roots and submerged obstacles that make sight less reliable. That is where catfish, gars, and bowfins come into their own. Catfish use sensitive barbels and chemical cues to locate food in dim conditions. Gars wait with patient precision, striking with long jaws when the moment is right. Bowfins combine stealth, toughness, and an ability to cope with oxygen-poor water that defeats many competitors. These fish are not merely surviving poor conditions. They are built for a world where vision is limited and the environment rewards other senses and strategies. To watch them in imagination is to understand that murk is not failure in nature. It is habitat, and some hunters become exceptional precisely because the water is hard to read. Bowfins still carry ancient features from deep fish history. A bowfin does not look like a relic in the way a fossil does, yet it carries echoes of a very old branch of fish evolution. Its long dorsal fin ripples like a ribbon when it moves. Its skull and body plan preserve characteristics that help scientists place it near lineages far older than most of the freshwater fish people know well. This gives the animal a strange presence. It is fully alive in the present, still hunting in swamps, backwaters, and weedy shallows. Yet it also hints at deep evolutionary history beneath that ordinary reality. Seeing one is not like stepping back in time exactly, because bowfins have been evolving all along. Still, they remind us that wetlands often shelter creatures with ancient roots. A swamp can hold not only busy modern ecosystems, but living representatives of lineages that stretch far into the planet's earlier chapters. The water seems contemporary. The ancestry inside it is immense. Gar scales are so tough they once served as arrow points. Long before modern synthetic materials, people noticed the remarkable armor carried by gar. Their scales are not soft and flexible like those of many fishes. They are hard, interlocking, and coated with a shiny enamel-like substance that makes the body feel almost plaited. Indigenous peoples in parts of North America found practical uses for that toughness, including making arrow points and other tools from the scales. The fact itself sounds almost unbelievable at first, because fish scales are usually imagined as fragile flakes, not raw material sturdy enough for weaponry. Yet gar are built differently. Their bodies seem halfway between animal and armor, an adaptation that has helped them endure in predator-filled waters for a very long time. This adds another layer to their fascination. A fish, gliding through swamp shallows, is not only a hunter. It is wearing a suit of protection so effective that humans once borrowed it for their own purposes. Swamps can hold astonishing biodiversity even when they seem visually uniform. A wetland may look repetitive from the outside. Water, trunks, reeds, mud, and more water. To an untrained eye, one patch can resemble the next so closely that the whole swamp appears simple. Yet that impression can be wildly misleading. Small differences in depth, shade, salinity, flow, soil type, and seasonal flooding create a patchwork of microhabitats where different species find their place. One shallow edge favors tiny invertebrates. A shaded paw shelters amphibians. A sunlit opening supports floating plants and basking reptiles. A rotting stump becomes home to beetles, fungi, and nesting birds nearby. The visual sameness hides ecological variety, the way a calm surface hides underwater motion. This is one reason swamps reward slow attention. The more closely you look, the more the apparent monotony breaks apart into layers of specialization. What seemed like one habitat becomes dozens, each hosting its own cast of residents and relationships. A fallen log in a swamp can become an entire apartment block. The moment a trunk drops into wetland water, it begins a second career. Algae and bacteria colonize the surface. Insects lay eggs in cracks and softened bark. Snails graze. Small fish shelter beside the wood. Turtles climb up to bask if part of it stays above the surface. Frogs hide in the damp margins. Fungi thread through the interior. With time, the log becomes less like debris and more like infrastructure, a multi-level habitat serving species that feed, hide, breed, and rest there. Some use the outer surface. Others tunnel into the wood. Predators patrol the edges because prey gathers in abundance. What makes this so beautiful is the efficiency of it. Nothing has to be built from scratch. A single fallen tree becomes housing, dining space, nursery ground, and hunting platform all at once. In a swamp, even collapse can create new opportunity, and dead wood becomes crowded with life. Swamp fungi recycle drowned wood that would otherwise linger for years. Water slows many forms of decay, but it does not stop the great work of breakdown entirely. Fungi are among the quiet specialists that keep wetland wood from remaining forever unchanged. They invade soaked trunks, branches, and roots with networks of microscopic threads that release enzymes capable of dismantling tough compounds such as cellulose and lignin. In other words, they attack the very materials that make wood strong. This matters enormously in swamps, where fallen timber can accumulate faster than some other decomposers can handle it. Fungi help turn stubborn wood back into softer matter that other organisms can use, passing nutrients onward through the ecosystem. The process is slow enough to feel patient, yet active enough to reshape whole logs from the inside out. A branch that seems merely waterlogged may already be under quiet occupation. In a swamp, even drowned wood is not abandoned. It is being carefully taken apart and returned to circulation. Termites and microbes both help turn flooded forests back into soil. A swamp forest is never only growing. It is also being taken apart with extraordinary patience. When trunks fall, branches snap, and leaves collect in damp layers, a hidden workforce begins its work. Microbes seep through softening wood and leaf litter, breaking complex material into simpler forms. In places that dry enough at times, termites join the process with astonishing efficiency, chewing, tunneling, and fragmenting plant matter that once stood as part of the forest canopy. Together, these tiny recyclers help convert the remains of trees back into soil, nutrients, and organic material that can feed the next generation of life. It is a grand transformation carried out by small bodies. A towering swamp tree may live for centuries, yet after it falls, whole legions of decomposers begin the long return. In wetlands, even decay has architecture. The forest does not merely die back. It is carefully dismantled and folded into the ground beneath it. In tropical swamps, buttress roots help giant trees stay upright. Some tropical swamp trees rise to astonishing heights from ground that seems far too soft to support them. The secret often lies in buttress roots, those great flaring walls of wood that spread from the base of the trunk like fins or folded sails. Instead of relying only on deep anchoring roots in unstable, waterlogged soil, the tree extends support outward, widening its base and distributing the strain of height and wind across a broader area. The result can look almost sculptural. A massive trunk does not simply emerge from the mud. It appears to stand on wooden wings. These roots also create pockets of shade, hollows, and pathways used by animals moving through the wetland floor. So what begins as a structural solution becomes habitat as well. In a tropical swamp, engineering and beauty often arrive together. A giant tree solves the problem of standing tall in soft ground by becoming more dramatic at ground level. Swamp canopies can hide monkeys, birds, snakes, and orchids all at once. When people picture swamps, they often focus on the waterline, the roots, the mud, and the life moving close to the surface. Yet in many tropical wetlands, another world begins overhead. The canopy can hold an entire hidden community that rarely reveals itself all at once. Monkeys travel branch to branch above flooded ground. Birds nest, call, and flash through shafts of light. Snakes drape along limbs where they nearly vanish against bark and leaves. Orchids cling high on trunks and branches, blooming far above the dark water below. This vertical layering makes a swamp feel much larger than it first appears. There is the world at your feet, the world below the water, and the world lifted into the trees. Each level hosts different lives, different risks, and different opportunities. A swamp is not only wide, it is tall with secrets. Look down and you miss half the story. Look up and the wetland multiplies. Freshwater swamp forests can form where rivers lose patience and spread. A river does not always remain disciplined within a single clear channel. In flat country, especially where the land offers little slope, water may slow, split, and spill across broad, low areas. Instead of rushing onward in a narrow path, it spreads into backwaters, side channels, seasonally flooded flats, and long, soaked ground that stays wet enough for swamp forest to develop. Trees adapted to those conditions take hold, and the river's wandering energy begins to shape a new kind of landscape. This is not a failure of the river to keep course. It is one of the ways rivers build richness into the land around them. By spreading out, they create habitat complexity deliver sediments, and sustain wetlands that can support fish, birds, reptiles, insects, and forests rooted in flood. A swamp forest born this way carries the signature of a river, but stopped acting like a line and started acting like a region. Flood pulses are not accidents, but part of swamp design. To human planners, floods often look like mistakes, interruptions, or disasters that need correcting. In many swamps, they are part of the operating system. Seasonal rises in water bring fresh connections between places that may remain separate during drier periods. Fish reach breeding grounds. Nutrients move into new areas. Seeds drift into bare patches. Organic matter lifts, settles, and feeds the next cycle of growth. Then, as water recedes, the landscape changes again. Pools shrink. Feeding grounds appear. Different species take over the stage. This repeated pulse is not random background noise. It is the rhythm around which the swamp has evolved. Remove it or flatten it into a constant level, and the whole system can begin to lose its timing. A healthy swamp often depends not on permanent sameness, but on alternating abundance and retreat. The flood is not always an intrusion from outside. Very often, it is the event that makes the wetland itself possible. Some swamps disappear in one season and reappear in the next. There are wetlands that seem to play hide and seek with the year. During a wet season, shallow basins fill, plants awaken, amphibians breed, insects hatch, and birds arrive as though the swamp has returned from nowhere. Then, the rains stop. Water retreats. Mud cracks. Vegetation changes character. To a casual visitor, the place may no longer even look like a wetland at all. Yet the swamp has not truly vanished. It has shifted into another state and is waiting for the next favorable turn. This seasonal invisibility is one reason temporary wetlands are so easily overlooked and so often undervalued. They do not advertise themselves all year long. But when the water returns, life responds with astonishing speed because seeds, eggs, dormant stages, and buried organisms have been waiting for exactly that moment. The landscape remembers what it is, even when it appears dry. In swamps, absence can be a form of preparation. Seasonal swamps can trigger sudden explosions of breeding, feeding, and migration. The first return of water after a dry stretch can transform a quiet landscape with almost shocking speed. Dormant eggs hatch. Frogs begin calling. Insects emerge in numbers that seem impossible only days earlier. Fish move into newly flooded areas to feed or spawn. Birds arrive because fresh, shallow water offers exactly the conditions they have been waiting for. It is as though an invisible signal has been sent across the food web, and everything responds at once. These bursts of activity are among the most dramatic expressions of swamp timing. Life does not unfold there at a steady pace all year. It often comes in concentrated surges tied to rainfall, flooding, and the reappearance of temporary habitat. That urgency makes perfect sense. A seasonal wetland offers opportunity, but only for a limited window. So when the water comes, the swamp can erupt with movement, sound, hunger, courtship, and travel in a remarkably short time. Swamps helped shape the evolution of animals that tolerate low oxygen. Life in a swamp can be demanding in ways that are easy to overlook. Warm, still water and muddy sediments often contain far less oxygen than fast-flowing streams or well-mixed lakes. Over long periods, that challenge has favored animals able to endure conditions that would overwhelm less adaptable species. Some fish rise to gulp air. Some turtles survive long spans of reduced oxygen by slowing their bodies and altering their chemistry. Certain invertebrates and amphibians cope through tolerance, timing, or behavior that keeps them alive in water others would avoid. A swamp is therefore more than habitat. It is an evolutionary filter. It rewards bodies that can remain calm when oxygen runs low and punishes those that cannot. This helps explain why so many wetland animals seem unusually tough, strange, or inventive. They are products of a landscape that regularly asks a brutal question. Can you keep going when the very water around you gives you less to breathe? Some swamp plants move oxygen from leaves down into drowned roots. For a plant rooted in flooded soil, the problem is severe. Sunlight may be plentiful above, but below the surface the roots can be stranded in mud where oxygen is scarce. Some swamp plants solve this by turning themselves into internal transport systems. Air enters through leaves and stems, then travels through special tissues full of open spaces that guide oxygen downward into submerged parts of the plant. In effect, the plant carries its own breath from sky to root. This allows it to survive in ground that would suffocate many other species. The idea is wonderful because it makes the whole organism feel connected in a new way. Leaves are not merely for catching light. They also help support life far below the waterline. A swamp plant can stand with its feet in drowning soil and still thrive by moving air through its own body, like a living bridge between atmosphere and mud. Tiny algae in swamps can support food webs far larger than themselves. They are easy to miss because they can be microscopic, suspended in water or coating surfaces in thin green films. Yet algae are among the great quiet producers of swamp life. Using sunlight, they build fresh organic matter that feeds tiny grazers and small aquatic animals, which are then eaten by larger creatures moving up the chain. A wetland rich in algae may be supporting insects, snails, fish, frogs, and birds without most observers ever noticing where much of that energy began. In some places, algae grow on submerged stems, on mud, on floating surfaces, or in the water itself, creating multiple entry points into the food web. Their importance can be especially striking in shallow, productive wetlands where light reaches much of the water column. The lesson is humbling. A swamp does not rely only on its obvious giants like trees and reeds. Sometimes the smallest green lives are helping feed almost everything else. Swamps can begin as glacial leftovers, river backwaters, or coastal transitions. Not every swamp has the same origin story, and that variety makes them even more fascinating. Some begin in depressions left behind by retreating glaciers, where meltwater gathered and vegetation slowly took hold. Others form in abandoned bends and backwaters where rivers changed course and left wet, low ground behind. Along coasts, swamps can appear where fresh water, tidal influence, sediment, and slow drainage meet in unstable borderlands. That means a swamp is not one single kind of place repeated over and over. It is a wetland answer to many different geological histories. One may owe its existence to ancient ice, another to a restless river, another to the long negotiation between land and sea. When you step into a swamp, you are often stepping into the afterlife of some older landscape event. The water may seem still, but the history that created it can involve glaciers, floods, coastline shifts, and centuries of ecological succession. Even a small swamp can influence the health of an entire watershed. Size can be deceptive in wetlands. A modest swamp tucked into one corner of a landscape may look minor on a map, yet its effects can travel far beyond its edges. Water entering that small basin may slow, spread, cool, settle, and leave in altered condition. Sediment may drop out. Nutrients may be taken up or transformed. Organic matter may feed food webs that extend into streams and rivers beyond the swamp itself. During storms, even a small wetland can hold back part of a surge that would otherwise move downstream more abruptly. During dry times, it may release water gradually and help sustain local flow. Species also use small swamps as stepping stones, breeding sites, refuges, or seasonal feeding grounds. Remove one, and the damage may show up somewhere else entirely. That is the hidden power of wetlands. A place that seems locally small can still be systemically important across a much larger landscape. Wetlands, once dismissed as wasteland, are now recognized as natural infrastructure. For a long time, many people looked at swamps and saw inconvenience. They saw soggy ground that resisted farming, slowed roads, bred insects, and seemed to offer little compared with drained land or built surfaces. So wetlands were filled, ditched, cut off, and treated as obstacles to progress. What changed was not the swamp itself, but our understanding. Scientists, planners, and communities began to recognize that these places store floodwater, support fisheries, clean runoff, stabilize coasts, and provide habitat that cannot easily be replaced once lost. In other words, swamps were performing essential work all along. We had simply failed to count it. Calling wetlands natural infrastructure captures that shift in perspective. It means a swamp is not empty space waiting for improvement. It is already doing jobs that cities and societies depend on. The remarkable part is that nature built this infrastructure without concrete pipes or steel, and often performs multiple services at once. Draining swamps often destroys services people only notice once they vanish. A drained swamp may briefly look like a gain. The land appears drier, easier to cross, easier to build on, and more obedient to human plans. Yet the losses often reveal themselves later and somewhere else. Floods may arrive faster because the water has nowhere to spread and slow. Water quality may decline because runoff now moves downstream with fewer natural filters in the way. Fisheries may weaken because breeding and nursery habitat has disappeared. Birds vanish. Fire risk can rise when previously wet soils dry out. Even ground stability may change as peat shrinks and subsides. The tragedy is that many of these services were invisible while the swamp was intact. People noticed the mosquito, the mud, or the inconvenience, but not the buffering, storage, cleaning, and biological support happening in the background. Only after drainage do those missing functions become obvious. By then, the wetland's value is no longer theoretical. It is measured in problems. Restored swamps can return birds, fish, frogs, and cleaner water. One of the most hopeful things about wetlands is that some of their lost functions can come back when the right conditions are restored. A degraded swamp may look ruined, channelized, drained, or overrun, yet if water levels, flow patterns, and vegetation begin to recover, life often responds with surprising speed. Frogs return because breeding habitat reappears. Fish move back into reconnecting channels and flooded margins. Birds discover fresh feeding and nesting areas. Water entering the wetland may once again slow down and pass through living filters of soil, roots, and microbial activity. Restoration is rarely simple, and no repaired wetland becomes a perfect copy of what was there before. Still, the comeback can be astonishing. It reminds us that swamps are not fragile in only one direction. They are also capable of recovery when given the chance. A rewetted, reconnected wetland can begin acting like a swamp again, and the wider landscape notices. Rewilding a swamp can start with nothing more dramatic than rewetting soil. When people imagine restoration, they often picture major construction, heavy equipment, and grand interventions. Sometimes those are necessary. Yet in many damaged wetlands, the first truly transformative step is deceptively simple. Water has to come back and stay long enough for the old chemistry, vegetation, and ecological rhythms to begin returning. Block a drainage ditch. Raise a breached bank. Reconnect a floodplain. remove the barrier that kept the soil unnaturally dry. Once the ground is re-wetted, a chain of changes can begin. Oxidation slows. Peat stops disappearing so quickly. Wetland plants gain an advantage over dry land invaders. Dormant seeds may germinate. Amphibians, insects, and water birds may rediscover habitat that had been missing in plain sight. This is part of the wonder of rewilding. The swamp does not always need to be rebuilt piece by piece. Sometimes it only needs the return of its most basic condition, which is persistent wetness. Swamp restoration often succeeds by letting water remember its old paths. Many damaged wetlands are injured not because all life has vanished, but because water has been forced to move in the wrong way. Channels are straightened. Floodplains are cut off. Levees, roads, ditches, and culverts interrupt patterns that once spread water across the landscape in subtle, seasonal rhythms. Restoration can succeed when those constraints are removed or softened enough for flow to resume something closer to its former behavior. Water spills again into old depressions. Side channels reconnect. Floods linger where they once rushed past. The phrase, "letting water remember," is not literal, of course, but it captures something true. Landscapes often still hold the shape of former movement, even after people have altered them. Reopen the root, and the wetland begins to reassemble around that returning pattern. Plants, animals, and soils respond to the hydrology that made the swamp possible in the first place. Often the smartest restoration move is simple humility. Some of the world's richest oil began in ancient swamp plants. This is one of the grandest deep-time twists in Earth history. Long ago, vast wetlands and swampy environments produced enormous quantities of plant material. In certain settings, especially where organic remains accumulated and were buried under sediments, that carbon-rich matter escaped complete decay. Over immense spans of time, heat, pressure, and geological transformation altered some of it into hydrocarbons. The result is that part of the energy driving the modern world began as ancient wetland life capturing sunlight. This does not mean every oil deposit comes from the same source, but swamp plants played an important role in the story of many fossil fuels. The idea can feel almost surreal. A lush, vanished wetland, crowded with vegetation in a world no human ever saw, becomes buried, altered, and eventually tapped by drills millions of years later. In that sense, some of the world's wealth is deep-stored swamp sunshine from another age. Coal is, in part, the deep-time legacy of vanished swamps. Before coal was ever mined, burned or hauled in black trains across industrial landscapes, it began as living plant matter in ancient, wet environments. In swampy settings where dead vegetation accumulated faster than it fully decomposed, thick organic deposits built up over long periods. Burial, pressure, heat, and time then transformed those deposits through stages that eventually produced coal. So when people speak of coal seams, they are also speaking in part about lost wetlands compressed into stone like archives of a prehistoric biosphere. The thought changes how coal feels. It is no longer just a fuel. It is fossilized ecology, the remains of vast plant communities that once stood in water, captured carbon from ancient air, and entered the earth instead of returning quickly to the atmosphere. A vanished swamp can survive in this strange form for hundreds of millions of years. Then humans dig it up and release that old sunlight in fire. Giant swamp forests once helped raise oxygen to extraordinary prehistoric levels. During parts of the Carboniferous period, immense swamp forests spread across broad lowlands of the ancient world. Towering club moss relatives, giant horsetails, ferns, and other plants captured vast amounts of carbon through photosynthesis. When so much plant material accumulated in wet ground and avoided complete decomposition, more carbon was buried rather than rapidly returned to the atmosphere. Over long stretches, that imbalance helped oxygen levels rise far above what we experience today. The consequences were dramatic. High oxygen may have supported enormous arthropods and influenced fire behavior across prehistoric landscapes. In other words, swamp forests were not merely local ecosystems. They were participants in reshaping the chemistry of the whole planet. That is a staggering idea. A wetland, multiplied across continents and through time, helped alter the very air. The next time a swamp seems small or marginal, it is worth remembering that ancient ones once helped tune the atmosphere for an entire age. Ancient swampy worlds may have helped insects grow far larger than today. When scientists uncover fossils of enormous ancient arthropods, the imagination wakes up immediately. Dragonfly-like predators with wingspans far beyond those of modern species. Millipede relatives long enough to seem almost unbelievable. These creatures lived in parts of the prehistoric world, when vast swampy forests spread across lowlands, and atmospheric oxygen may have been much higher than it is now. Many researchers think those oxygen-rich conditions helped certain arthropods support larger bodies than would be practical today. The swamp connection matters because those wet forests were part of the planetary process that helped shape the air itself. So the giant insects of deep time were not just strange accidents. They may have been products of a world in which wetland plants, atmospheric chemistry, and animal physiology were all linked. It is a thrilling idea. Ancient swamps may not only have hosted weird giants, they may have helped make them possible. Swamps can drown sound, distort distance, and change how animals communicate. A swamp does not carry sound in a simple way. Water, dense vegetation, open pools, tree trunks, humidity, and soft ground all affect how calls travel. Some sounds are absorbed and muffled. Others roll strangely across water and seem closer or farther away than they really are. In a place like that, communication becomes a challenge of timing, pitch, and persistence. Frogs may call from positions that let their voices carry just enough. Birds choose perches and moments that help signal through cluttered space. Insects fill the air with repeated patterns that cut through background noise. Predators and prey both have to interpret a world where hearing can mislead. That gives swamp acoustics a fascinating power. The landscape itself becomes part of the conversation. A call is never just a call. It is also a test against reeds, trunks, misty air, and water that throws sound around in unexpected ways. The swamp shapes what can be heard. Some snakes hunt swamps by sensing vibration more than clear sight. In dark water, tangled roots, and heavy vegetation, vision is not always the best guide. For some swamp-dwelling snakes, success depends more on reading motion than on getting a perfect view. Vibrations in water and ground can reveal a struggling fish, a passing frog, or the movement of something edible just beyond sight. The snake does not need the seam to look clear and tidy the way a human would prefer. It needs the environment to speak through touch and subtle disturbance. Tongue flicking adds chemical information from the air and surfaces, while the body itself remains tuned to a world of shifts, ripples, and contact. This makes swamp hunting feel almost ghostly. Prey can be found in murk, in reeds, at night, or beneath cover where sight would fail. The hunter becomes an interpreter of the unseen. In wetlands, not every predator depends on looking harder. Some win by feeling more. Otters, panthers, and bears all use swamps in surprisingly different ways. The same wetland can mean entirely different things to different mammals. Otters treat swamps as hunting grounds and travel corridors, slipping through channels and pools in pursuit of fish, crayfish, and other aquatic prey. Anthers may use dense swamp cover as shelter, daytime refuge, or a route through landscapes where dry ground has become fragmented by people. Bears often approach wetlands as seasonal supermarkets, feeding on fruits, roots, insects, carrion, or whatever else the swamp provides at the right moment. None of these animals experiences the wetland in the same way. One reads it as water. Another reads it as cover. Another reads it as opportunity spread across shifting food sources. That is part of the genius of swamps. They do not serve a single role, even for large, charismatic animals. They become different landscapes depending on who is moving through them, what they need, and what season has turned the wetland into that day. Swamps near coasts can buffer saltwater as seas push inland. At the edge of the sea, fresh water and salt water are always negotiating. Coastal swamps can slow that inland advance by holding fresh water in soils, channels, and wet ground that help resist salt intrusion. They act as transition zones, not rigid walls, but that role can still be crucial for nearby forests, farms, aquifers, and habitats that depend on lower salinity. When coastal wetlands remain connected and healthy, they can soften the push of salt farther inland during tides, storms, and periods of rising sea level. Their vegetation and hydrology help maintain a shifting but important boundary. This matters because salt does not only change what grows in one patch of swamp. It can transform water supplies, soil chemistry, and entire ecological communities beyond the visible shoreline. A coastal swamp is therefore not just sitting at the boundary between land and sea. It is helping negotiate that boundary every day through water stored, slowed, and released. Rising seas are forcing some swamps to move, shrink, or transform. A swamp may seem rooted in place, but coastal wetlands are increasingly being pushed into difficult choices by the rising sea. In some areas, they migrate inland as salt reaches farther upslope and new wet ground becomes available behind them. In other places, roads, cities, levees, or steep terrain block that retreat, leaving the swamp trapped between advancing water and fixed human boundaries. Then the choice is narrow. Parts of the wetland may shrink, convert to more open water, or shift into salt-tolerant communities unlike what stood there before. This is not a neat or orderly process. It can happen patch by patch, season by season, with different species responding at different speeds. The result is a moving, ecological frontier. A swamp that seemed stable for generations may suddenly reveal how mobile it must become to survive. Rising seas are not only drowning coasts, they are rewriting where swamps can still exist. Ghost forests appear when coastal swamps lose their fight with salt. Sometimes the change arrives as silence in wood. Trees that once stood alive in coastal wetlands die after repeated saltwater intrusion, yet their trunks remain upright for years, pale and lifeless against marsh or open water that now surrounds them. These are ghost forests, and they are among the most haunting landscapes on a changing coast. The dead trees show where a freshwater or less salty swamp once held its ground, and where that ground has now shifted into something else. Salt damages roots, disrupts water uptake, and gradually overwhelms species not built for such conditions. The trees do not always fall at once. They linger as witnesses to a failed resistance. To walk or paddle past them is to see ecological change made visible in a single glance. The living forest is gone, but its skeleton remains, marking the exact place where one kind of swamp lost the right to continue. Swamps are among the few places where decay and creation stay side by side. In many landscapes, growth and breakdown feel separated in the mind. One belongs to spring and sunlight. The other belongs to decline. Swamps collapse that distinction. Fresh shoots rise from water beside rotting trunks. New roots thread through mud full of old leaves. Larvae feed in water darkened by decomposition, then emerge into the air above living flowers and green stems. Dead wood becomes habitat. Fallen plants become soil. Buried remains feed future growth. Nowhere does this feel more immediate than in a wetland, where the processes of ending and beginning occur almost in the same breath. That is part of why swamps feel so philosophically rich. They do not hide decay, and they do not let decay have the last word either. Everything seems to be turning into something else. A swamp is not a place caught between life and death. It is a place where both are working together continuously. Hidden channels in swamps can redirect water with almost no warning. From the surface, a swamp can appear flat and indecisive, yet beneath that impression lies a subtle network of paths where water prefers to move. Some are obvious channels. Others are half-concealed routes through vegetation, depressions in the soil, or old stream traces that fill and connect only under certain conditions. When rainfall, floodwater, or shifting levels activate these pathways, water can suddenly start moving in directions that seemed impossible moments before. A quiet pool begins to drain. A patch of forest floods from an unexpected side. Floating plants drift into a new line. Fish and debris follow routes no casual observer would have predicted. This hidden plumbing gives swamps much of their mystery. The map is not always visible until the water decides to reveal it. A wetland can look still, then quietly reorganize itself through channels that were there all along, waiting for the right depth and pressure to matter. Swamp maps can change faster than human boundaries drawn across them. People love stable lines. We mark property, counties, protected areas, and management zones as though the land underneath will hold still for paperwork and law. Swamps often refuse that bargain. Channels migrate. Floating mats drift. Sediment builds in one place while water opens another. Storms carve shortcuts. Drought exposes ground that floods again months later. Salinity shifts vegetation. Fire changes structure. A map made at one moment may already be aging as soon as it is printed. This does not mean mapping swamps is pointless. It means any map of a wetland is partly a snapshot of movement rather than a final description of place. That is what makes swamps so fascinating to study and so challenging to govern. Human boundaries prefer certainty. Wetlands prefer process. The living terrain keeps revising itself according to water, growth, disturbance, and time, often faster than our fixed lines are prepared to admit. Some swamp soils are so soft they ripple under a careful step. There are wetlands where the ground does not feel like ground in the ordinary human sense. You place your foot down expecting firmness, and instead the surface trembles, bows, or sends a slow wave outward through soaked organic matter beneath you. That unsettling motion happens because some swamp soils are built from waterlogged peat, roots, decaying plant material, and fine sediments that have not compacted into anything solid by our everyday standards. The earth behaves more like a floating skin than a dependable floor. To walk there is to feel the swamp reminding you that land itself is conditional. For plants and animals adapted to it, that softness is normal. For us, it feels almost magical, as though the landscape were breathing under pressure. It also changes everything about movement, anchoring, and survival. In swamps, even the simplest act of standing still can become a lesson in how alive and unstable a wetland really is. Floating peat can support shrubs and trees on surprisingly little ground. One of the strangest sights in a swamp is a patch of seeming woodland that is not truly anchored to solid earth below. Floating peat can form thick mats of interwoven roots, mosses, stems, and partially decayed plant matter strong enough to support shrubs and even trees, despite resting on water or semi-liquid substrate. What looks like ordinary land may in fact be a raft built slowly by living growth and persistent accumulation. That gives such places a dreamlike quality. A thicket stands upright. Birds perch and nest. Small animals move through it. Yet beneath the surface, the whole platform may rise and fall subtly with changing water levels. This matters ecologically because floating peat creates habitat in places where open water might otherwise dominate. It matters emotionally because it challenges our basic sense of what a landscape should be. In a swamp, a forest can exist where the ground beneath it is barely ground at all. Swamps can trap nutrients so effectively that nearby waters stay healthier. When rain and runoff move across a landscape, they often carry nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients picked up from soils, farms, roads, and human settlements. If too much of that load reaches lakes, rivers, or coasts unchecked, the result can be algae blooms, oxygen loss, and damaged ecosystems downstream. Swamps help interrupt that chain. Their shallow water, dense plants, and slow movement create conditions where nutrients can be taken up by vegetation, stored in soils, or transformed by microbes before they travel farther. The wetland acts less like a simple barrier and more like a living processor. Materials enter, pause, and are handled in ways that reduce the pressure on waters beyond. This is one reason a swamp can protect places people care about, even when those places lie miles away. The health of an estuary, fishery, or stream may depend partly on the soggy patch of ground upstream doing quiet biochemical work. Nutrient overload can unravel swamp balance and favor entirely different species. A swamp adapted to lean or moderate nutrient levels can change dramatically when too much fertilizer-rich runoff begins pouring in. Plants that once grew slowly under tight chemical limits may be overtaken by faster, more aggressive species that capitalize on the sudden abundance. Algae may bloom more heavily. Water clarity can shift. Oxygen conditions may worsen when extra growth dies and decomposes. The entire wetland begins to favor a new cast of winners. This is what makes nutrient pollution so deceptive. It does not always arrive looking like poison. Sometimes it arrives looking like more growth, more green, more apparent productivity. Yet that extra richness can dismantle the old balance and replace a diverse mosaic with a simpler, more dominated system. Species adapted to scarcity or subtle seasonal rhythms may lose ground quickly. A swamp can still remain wet and green while becoming ecologically less itself. Too much nourishment in the wrong place can behave like a kind of erasure. Invasive plants can turn open swamp mosaics into dense green walls. A healthy swamp often contains variety in spacing, light, and movement. Open pools connect to reed beds. Patches of shrubs give way to channels, mud margins, and mixed vegetation. That mosaic matters because different species depend on different pieces of it. When an invasive plant takes over, the pattern can collapse into something far more uniform. Fast-growing outsiders may form dense stands that choke waterways, block light, suppress native plants, and reduce the structural variety that fish, birds, reptiles, and insects rely on. From a distance, the invaded wetland may still look lush, even beautiful, in a blunt green way. Up close, it can feel sealed shut. The swamp loses openness, texture, and many of the transitions that once made it rich. This is one of the cruelest tricks of biological invasion. It can make a wetland appear full while actually making it poorer, flatter, and much less welcoming to the life that belonged there before. The healthiest swamps usually depend on disturbance, not perfect stillness. People often imagine nature at its best as calm, stable, and undisturbed forever. Swamps tell a different story. Many of them rely on periodic change, such as flood pulses, dry spells, fire, storms, shifting channels, falling trees, and animal engineering to maintain their diversity and function. Disturbance opens patches of light, resets competition, redistributes nutrients, and prevents one habitat type from taking over everything. It creates opportunity for species that would otherwise be crowded out by slower-moving dominance. In that sense, a healthy swamp is not frozen in balance. It is balanced through change. The rhythm may look messy from the outside, but the mess is often the mechanism. Remove every disruption, and the wetland can simplify or stagnate in ways that reduce what made it special. A swamp does not always want to be left in perfect stillness. Very often it needs interruption, because change is part of how wetland richness stays alive. Swamps are shaped as much by timing as by water. Two swamps can receive similar amounts of water and still become very different places if that water arrives on different schedules. Timing decides when fish can spawn, when amphibians breed, when seeds germinate, when birds find prey concentrated, and when soils shift from soaked to exposed. A flood in the wrong season may help one group and harm another. A drought that arrives too early can break a breeding cycle before it begins. Even fire interacts with timing, because the same event can have very different effects depending on when it happens relative to rain, nesting, flowering, or seed release. That is why swamps are not governed by water quantity alone. They are ruled by sequence, rhythm, and duration. Nature cares not only about how much arrives, but when. A swamp is almost musical in that sense. Miss the beat, and the composition changes. Keep the timing, and the wetland can hold together in all its complicated life. To understand a swamp, you must follow both the flood and the drought. It is tempting to define a swamp only by its wettest moments, when water is high, channels spread, and the whole place looks fully itself. Yet that view tells only half the story. Drought reveals the hidden architecture of the wetland. Pools contract and show where depth remains. Trails appear. Burrows matter more. Predators and prey are compressed into shrinking space. Plants either endure, retreat, or wait. Then flood returns and reverses the scene, reconnecting habitats, lifting seeds and nutrients, and reopening the broader map. One phase explains the other. Without drought, you miss how the swamp concentrates life and tests endurance. Without flood, you miss how it renews, redistributes, and expands possibility. The wetland is not one condition. It is an oscillation. To know it properly, you have to watch it inhale and exhale through time. Only then does the real design appear, written across both abundance and absence. Swamps reveal that messiness in nature is often a form of balance. A swamp can look untidy by human standards. Water stands where roads would sink. Logs rot where a gardener would clear them away. Plants crowd, lean, and overlap. Channels twist without obvious order. Mud swallows boundaries. Yet within that apparent disorder lies a highly functional kind of balance, one built not from neat separation, but from overlapping roles and constant adjustment. Dead wood houses life. Flood rearranges food. Shade, decay, growth, and predation all operate together without waiting for clean lines. What appears chaotic from a distance often turns out to be deeply organized at the ecological level. Species use the mess. Nutrients move through it. Survival depends on it. This is one reason swamps can feel so profound. They confront a very human mistake, which is the belief that order must look tidy. In wetlands, balance may look tangled, dark, and unruly, yet still be exquisitely alive and entirely real. The more scientists study swamps, the less ordinary they seem. That may be the most fitting ending of all, because swamps have a habit of becoming stranger and more impressive the closer they are examined. A casual glance might see only mud, insects, still water, and trees standing where they should not. Careful study reveals carbon vaults, chemical engines, storm buffers, nurseries, archives of past climates, evolutionary workshops, and landscapes that shift with water in ways maps can barely hold. The mystery is not that people once misunderstood swamps. The mystery is how long it took to realize how much was hiding there in plain sight. Each layer of research seems to make them less like neglected margins and more like central players in the living planet. That is part of their enduring magic. A swamp does not lose wonder when science arrives. It gains more. The facts do not flatten it. They deepen it, until the ordinary-looking wetland becomes one of the most astonishing places on Earth. As our journey through the swamps comes to a close, perhaps they feel a little different now. Not as empty places or forgotten places, but as living worlds layered with movement, history, and quiet invention. We wandered through dark water and rooted forests. We passed floating islands, ancient trees, hidden channels, and air-breathing fish. We found orchids blooming in flooded ground, frogs turning night into sound, and old carbon sleeping beneath peat and mud. We traced the lives of birds, reptiles, insects, and mammals through a landscape that never truly stands still. And perhaps that is part of what makes swamps so fascinating. They remind us that life does not need neat edges to flourish. It can grow in soft ground. It can adapt to murky water. It can build beauty, complexity, and resilience in places once overlooked. So now, as this strange and remarkable wetland begins to fade into the distance, let your thoughts drift with it. Imagine the dark water settling, the trees standing watch, the last ripples smoothing into stillness. Let the sounds grow softer in your mind. Let the pathways of roots and water slowly dissolve into rest. And if you are somehow still awake, there will be another video waiting for you on the screen, ready to carry you onward into another world of sleepy curiosity. If you enjoyed spending this time here, you might leave a like, subscribe, or share a quiet thought below. It truly helps this little corner of the night reach more wandering minds. For now, though, let everything grow heavy. Let the day fall away. Sleep well, and good night.